Hey guys, tonight we're slipping into the cockpits, the carrier decks, and the command rooms of the men who attacked Pearl Harbor on December 7th, 1941. This is the story from the Japanese perspective. Before you get too comfortable, take a second to like and subscribe if you enjoy drifting off to deeply factual history. Now dim those lights. Why did Admiral Isoroku Yamamoto believe a single surprise strike could force America to negotiate peace? What was it like flying through the early morning dark, knowing your torpedo would be the first shot of a world war? And at what point did some of those pilots realize they might have just woken a sleeping giant? Let's find out. Congratulations! It is 3 o'clock in the morning on December 7th, 1941. You are not safe in your bed. You are strapped into the cockpit of a Nakajima B-5N torpedo bomber, perched on the flight deck of the aircraft carrier Akagi. The ship is pitching in heavy seas somewhere north of Hawaii. And in the darkness around you, 183 other planes are warming up, their propellers clawing at the black air. Your target is Pearl Harbor. Your mission: to deliver a blow so devastating that the United States will lose its stomach for a war in the Pacific before the fight even begins. This is not a hypothetical scenario invented for a history book. This is exactly what happened, and for the next 3 hours, we are going inside the minds of the men who lived it, the admirals, the pilots, and the strategists who believed they could reshape the world in a single morning. They did not see themselves as villains. They saw themselves as realists, backed into a corner by an American oil embargo, a tightening noose of economic strangulation that would soon leave their empire gasping for fuel. Their plan was audacious, meticulously rehearsed, and it almost worked. But somewhere between the early morning briefing and the last bomb dropping on Battleship Row, the seeds of a catastrophic miscalculation had already sprouted. To understand why Japan launched this attack, why they were so certain they could win, and the precise moment some of them realized they had just awakened a giant, we have to step further back, into the oil fields, the conference rooms, and the mind of the man who set it all in motion. Let's rewind to 1937. The world is a tinderbox, and Japan is holding the match. For decades, this island nation has been frantically transforming itself from a feudal society into an industrial powerhouse. But it has a fatal flaw. It possesses almost none of the raw materials necessary to sustain a modern war machine. No oil, no rubber, barely enough iron ore to fuel its military expansion across China and maintain its perceived destiny as the dominant power. In Asia, Japan must import nearly 90% of its oil, and almost all of it comes from the United States. That is a terrifying dependency for a country already locked in a brutal, grinding conflict on the Chinese mainland, a war of attrition that is swallowing soldiers, planes, and tanks at a rate its home islands cannot sustain. The generals and admirals in Tokyo understand a simple, brutal math problem. Without a secure source of fuel, the Imperial Japanese Navy will be nothing more than a collection of silent, rusting hulls within 2 years. Now, fast forward to the summer of 1941. The Japanese army has just moved into southern French Indochina, a clear step toward the oil-rich Dutch East Indies. Washington responds with the fury of a patient finally pushed too far. President Roosevelt freezes all Japanese assets in the United States, effectively severing Japan's access to American oil. It is an economic act of war without a single shot fired. For Japan's leaders, the clock is now ticking audibly. Every day the fleet trains, every hour a warship's engines run, they burn through a dwindling, irreplaceable stockpile. The choice is stark: submit to American demands, abandon the empire-building project that has cost so much blood, or seize the oil fields of Southeast Asia by force, even if that means a direct confrontation with the United States Pacific Fleet, the only force in the ocean capable of stopping them. This is the impossible equation handed to Admiral Isoroku Yamamoto, the commander-in-chief of Japan's combined fleet. To understand why Pearl Harbor happened, you have to understand the deeply contradictory man who planned it. Yamamoto was not a saber-rattling warmonger. He had studied at Harvard, served as a naval attaché in Washington, and had traveled extensively across the American industrial heartland. He had seen the endless factory belts of Detroit, the oil derricks of Texas, the sheer, staggering scale of American productive capacity. While many of his colleagues viewed Americans as soft, decadent, and unwilling to suffer for a distant war, Yamamoto knew better. He had played poker with American businessmen, toured their factories, and understood that this was a nation that, once angered, could outproduce and outfight any adversary on earth. In 1940, when Prime Minister Konoe asked him directly about a potential war with the United States, Yamamoto famously replied, "If I am told to fight regardless of the consequences, I shall run wild for the first 6 months or a year, but I have absolutely no confidence about the second and third years." He believed the only possible path to victory was a catastrophic initial blow, a psychological earthquake so severe that the American public would recoil from the prospect of a long Pacific War and demand a negotiated settlement. It was the logic of the gambler putting everything on a single, desperate hand, and the target of that opening hand, he decided, could be nowhere else but Pearl Harbor, the home port of the U.S. Pacific Fleet. The official Japanese naval strategy for decades had been to wait for the Americans to sail across the Pacific, weaken them with submarines and destroyers, and then destroy them in a gigantic, decisive battleship clash near the Philippines or the Mariana Islands. But Yamamoto was about to upend this entire doctrine with an idea that was so radical, it could get him fired, or worse. In January of 1941, he began putting pen to paper in a secret letter. It was written in carefully chosen words, but the conclusion was explosive. The combined fleet must launch a carrier-based airstrike against Pearl Harbor at the very opening of hostilities. He passed the letter to a trusted subordinate, Rear Admiral Takejiro Onishi, and tasked him with turning this wild concept into a workable military plan. Onishi, in turn, summoned a brilliant young staff officer named Minoru Genda. Genda was a fighter pilot at heart, a man who dreamed not of great battleship duels, but of massed air power, of entire carrier decks launching coordinated swarms of bombers and fighters. He was the perfect architect for this unconventional project. And when he read Yamamoto's letter, he did not hesitate. He told Onishi it was difficult, it was dangerous, but it was absolutely not impossible. Here is the first thing you must know about Genda's vision. It was built on a recent historical precedent that almost no one else had paid attention to. In November of 1940, the British Royal Navy had launched a nighttime carrier raid against the Italian fleet anchored in the shallow harbor of Taranto. Ancient swordfish biplanes, slow and seemingly obsolete, had flown through anti-aircraft fire and sunk 3 battleships in a single night. The lesson was not lost on the Japanese naval staff. If a handful of fabric-covered biplanes could cripple a fleet at anchor, what could 300 of the world's most advanced carrier aircraft do if they caught the Americans asleep? But the technical challenges were immense. Pearl Harbor is shallow, with a typical depth of 40 to 45 feet. Standard Japanese torpedoes, when dropped from an airplane, plunged deep into the water and buried themselves in the mud before racing toward their target. Genda knew they needed a torpedo that could run in just 30 feet of water, or the whole plan would be nothing but a noisy fireworks display that left the battleships unscathed. Here, the obsessive Japanese engineering culture took over. At the Nagasaki Weapons Factory, engineers frantically worked to modify the Type 91 aerial torpedo, adding wooden tail fins that would break away on impact. allowing the weapon to run a shallower trajectory. They tested them relentlessly in the waters of Kagoshima Bay, a location deliberately chosen because its geography, a narrow inlet surrounded by mountains, eerily mirrored the shape of Pearl Harbor. Day after day, pilots flew at wave-top height, skimming telephone poles and diving between smokestacks, practicing the impossible approach angles needed to thread a torpedo into a battleship moored in a double row. While the torpedo problem was being solved, another branch of planners were wrestling with the challenge of armor-piercing bombs. The American battleships were protected by thick steel decks. A conventional bomb dropped from altitude would simply bounce off or explode harmlessly on the upper superstructure. So the Japanese ordnance men took a 16-inch naval artillery shell, incredibly heavy and capped with armor-piercing steel, and fitted it with fins to transform it into a gravity bomb. This was the weapon intended for the high-level bombers, meant to smash through the deck armor and detonate deep inside the ammunition magazines. If the torpedo bombers were the daggers, these converted shells were the sledgehammers. But the planning was not just about hardware. It was about psychology and secrecy. Yamamoto knew that if the Americans got even a whisper of the plan, the entire operation would be a suicide run into a fully alerted battleship fleet, with every anti-aircraft gun and fighter plane waiting for them. So he enforced a level of compartmentalization that bordered on paranoia. The majority of the combined fleet staff officers, the very men who ran Japan's naval commands, were kept entirely in the dark. Only a tiny circle of insiders knew the target, and when Yamamoto's team finally presented the completed plan to the Naval General Staff in Tokyo, in the fall of 1941, they were met with a wall of polite but stubborn opposition. The strategy was too risky. It gambled the entire carrier force, the crown jewels of the Japanese Navy, on a single roll of the dice. If the American carriers happened to be absent, or if the fleet was detected en route, or if the defenses were unexpectedly robust, Japan could lose 6 carriers and its entire naval air arm in a single morning, a blow from which it could never recover. The debate raged through October. Vice Admiral Nagano, the chief of the Naval General Staff, remained deeply skeptical. Time was running out. The fuel stockpiles were draining by the hour, and still the men in Tokyo could not bring themselves to sign the death warrant of their own battle doctrine. But Yamamoto had one last card to play. He sent a message through his staff that if the plan was not approved, he and his entire combined fleet command staff would resign. This was not a bluff. The resignation of the fleet's most respected and famous admiral would have been an unthinkable political crisis, effectively decapitating the Navy on the eve of a war everyone knew was coming. Under that ultimatum, the Naval General Staff finally yielded. The attack was approved, though even then, many of the men who signed the orders did not truly believe it would succeed. Now, the plan had a commander. The man selected to lead the strike force was Vice Admiral Chuichi Nagumo, and this is one of the quiet tragedies of the story. Nagumo was a competent, cautious, and entirely conventional admiral whose expertise was in torpedo tactics, not carrier aviation. He was not the architect of the plan. He was its executor, and a reluctant one at that. He had no faith in the operation. During the final briefings, he expressed open doubt, famously telling Yamamoto's staff, "If I had been completely free to oppose this operation, I would have done so." He would sail to Pearl Harbor not as a bold gambler, but as a man carrying out orders he fundamentally distrusted, and that mindset, that caution, would shape the entire battle and its aftermath in ways that would haunt Japan to its very end. On November the 26th, 1941, the strike force assembled in the desolate, freezing isolation of Hitokapu Bay in the Kuril Islands, a place so remote and shrouded in fog that it was practically invisible to the outside world. 6 aircraft carriers, Akagi, Kaga, Soryu, Hiryu, Shokaku, and Zuikaku formed the heart of the force, surrounded by 2 battleships, 3 cruisers, 9 destroyers, and 8 supply tankers. Over 400 aircraft were crammed onto the carriers. The pilots received their final briefings. The target was famously marked with a red X on a map. They were told that this was a one-way mission if necessary, that they were striking a blow to secure the resources their nation needed to survive, and that the eyes of the Emperor were upon them. Then the anchor chains clattered up, and the fleet slipped into the heavy North Pacific swells under absolute radio silence. For the next 10 days, they would sail east through some of the stormiest seas on the planet, hidden beneath a curtain of winter clouds, hoping not to encounter a single neutral merchant ship that might betray their presence. If they were detected, the entire operation would be aborted. They had sailed into a void, and the only thing waiting for them at the other end was either a staggering victory or a watery grave. But here is the detail that twists the entire story. While Nagumo's carriers were slicing through the Black Pacific toward Hawaii, American intelligence was reading Japan's diplomatic mail. The code machines back in Washington could not crack the naval operational codes, but they had broken the diplomatic cipher months earlier. They knew that war was imminent. They had intercepted a message setting a deadline for Sunday, December 7th, for the Japanese embassy to deliver a final note. They even had radar installations on Oahu that could detect approaching planes at over 100 miles. And yet, in a cascade of inter-service rivalry, bureaucratic lethargy, and sheer disbelief that an attack on Pearl Harbor was even conceivable, none of that intelligence ever reached the right hands in time. A warning was sent, but it traveled via Western Union to the commander in Hawaii, arriving hours after the bombs had stopped falling. In the early hours of December 7th, the American Pacific Fleet lay at anchor, utterly unaware that the greatest carrier-based aerial attack in history was only 200 miles north and closing fast. And on the bridge of the Akagi, a man named Mitsuo Fuchida, the strike leader, was already awake, preparing to lead a generation of pilots into the fire that would change everything. That morning he would speak a single word into his radio, and the world would never be the same. The Akagi's flight deck heaved with the rhythm of a 20-knot wind and a restless winter sea. At 5:30 in the morning of December 7th, Commander Mitsuo Fuchida stood in the pre-dawn blackness, wrapped in a flight suit that still smelled of the kerosene heater in his quarters. He was 39 years old, a veteran pilot with over 3,000 hours in the air, and he was about to lead the largest carrier-based aerial strike force ever assembled into combat. Below him, the deck crews were shouting in the dark, their voices carried away by the wind as they manhandled torpedoes across the wet wood and maneuvered planes into launch position. The first wave of 183 aircraft, 49 high-level bombers, 40 torpedo bombers, 51 dive bombers, and 43 Zero fighters, was packed onto 6 flight decks, engines warming up in a thunderous chorus that could be heard for miles across the empty ocean. The ships had turned into the wind, a maneuver that pushed the heavy swells directly onto the bows, sending spray crashing over the flight deck. In a few minutes, these men would either change the balance of world power or die trying, and every single one of them knew it. Fuchida climbed into the observer's seat of his Nakajima B-5N bomber, the aircraft he had chosen to fly in so he could coordinate the entire attack rather than focus on his own bombing run. His pilot, Lieutenant Mitsuo Matsuzaki, was already running through the pre-flight checks. In the rear seat, Petty Officer First Class Tokunobu Mizuki, the radio operator, tested his signal lights. Fuchida checked the map board on his knees, a simple chart with Pearl Harbor marked in red at the center, and the individual target assignments for each squadron circled around it. He had been drilling this plan for months. He knew every channel, every battleship mooring position, every anti-aircraft battery on the island. Now there was nothing left to do but fly. At precisely 5:50, the lamp on the Akagi's island flashed a single green signal. The first Zero fighter roared down the deck and lifted into the darkness, its navigation lights blinking against the clouds. One after another, the planes followed, their engines tearing holes in the fog. It took 15 minutes for all 183 aircraft to get airborne. By the time the last fighter was aloft, the first ones were already circling overhead, forming up into their attack squadrons under the ghostly illumination of a quarter moon. Fuchida's plane banked into formation, and the entire armada turned south. Climbing to 9,000 feet above the cloud layer, the sun rose behind them, painting the horizon a deep blood red, a color that many of the pilots would later say felt like an omen. Below, the Pacific was a dark, endless sheet. Above, the sky was clearing, exactly as the weather reports had predicted. For the first time since leaving Hitokapu Bay, the entire operation felt almost blessed. The clouds had hidden them, the sea had held its peace, and now the target lay just over the horizon. 2 hours passed in the cold, vibrating cocoon of the aircraft. Fuchida tuned his radio through the frequencies, searching for the Honolulu commercial broadcast stations that the planners had identified as their long-range navigation beacon. Sure enough, through the static he caught the faint strains of American morning music, a jazz station playing something light and carefree. He signaled to Mizuki to take a bearing. The music was coming from dead ahead. They were right on course. This simple, surreal detail, the enemy's own radio station guiding them to the target, struck Fuchida with the force of a religious experience. He later wrote that in that moment, he felt the hand of divine providence guiding the mission. The Americans were singing and dancing through their Sunday morning, utterly unaware that the sky above them was filling with warplanes. At 7:40, the clouds ahead began to break, and there it was, the island of Oahu, a dark green silhouette ringed by white surf, exactly as it had appeared in the reconnaissance photographs they had all studied for months. Fuchida peered through his binoculars and let out a slow breath. Pearl Harbor lay directly below the cloud gap, and inside it, the entire American Pacific Fleet was at anchor. Every single battleship was there, arranged in neat rows along Battleship Row and beside Ford Island. No smoke screens, no anti-aircraft balloons, no fighters patrolling overhead. It was a peacetime Sunday morning, and the Americans were still asleep. Fuchida reached for his signal pistol and fired a single green flare into the sky. That was the signal for the torpedo bombers to begin their final approach. Then he leaned forward and spoke into the radio the 3 words that would be seared into history: Tora, Tora, Tora. It meant Tiger, a prearranged code that told the fleet and the high command in Tokyo that complete surprise had been achieved. Behind him, Mizuki tapped out the message in Morse code, and the signal raced back across the Pacific to Nagumo's bridge and beyond. The attack had begun. The first wave split into its pre-assigned attack groups with the precision of a rehearsed ballet. The torpedo bombers, led by Lieutenant Commander Shigeharu Murata, peeled off to the right and dove down toward the surface of the harbor, skimming so low that some pilots later reported seeing individual American sailors on deck looking up at them with expressions of confusion rather than alarm. The torpedoes they carried had been modified specifically for this moment, fitted with those wooden fins that would snap off when they hit the water, allowing the weapons to run at just 30 feet of depth. The pilots had practiced this exact attack run hundreds of times in Kagoshima Bay, flying through the narrow mountain passes until it was etched into their muscle memory. Now they lined up on Battleship Row, aiming for the largest targets first. The first torpedo struck the USS West Virginia at 7:55. Within seconds, 6 more torpedoes slammed into the Oklahoma, which immediately began to list so violently that men on her decks were thrown into the oil-slicked water. The California took 2 torpedoes and started to settle by the bow. The Nevada, moored at the northern end of the row, was hit once but managed to get her anti-aircraft guns firing. And then the Arizona. The old battleship was hit by a converted armor-piercing bomb dropped from a high-level bomber, a bomb that smashed through the forward deck and detonated deep inside the magazine. The explosion was so enormous that it lifted the entire bow out of the water, a column of black smoke and flame rising 2,000 feet into the sky. Fuchida, circling above, felt his plane buck from the shockwave. He saw men on other ships blown into the water by the concussion. The Arizona sank in 9 minutes, taking 1,177 men with her. In a single instant, the United States had lost more sailors than it had in the entire Spanish-American War. The dive bombers now began their runs. These were the ICD-3A1S, the Vals, screaming down at 70-degree angles with a distinctive whistle that American survivors would later describe as the sound of a world ending. They targeted the airfields first: Hickam Field, Wheeler Field, Ford Island. Each was hammered with fragmentation bombs designed to destroy parked aircraft and fuel stores. The Americans had lined up their planes wingtip to guard against sabotage, a peacetime precaution that now turned into a massacre. Within 20 minutes, 188 American aircraft were burning on the ground, most of them never having fired a shot. The Japanese Zero fighters, faster and more maneuverable than any American plane in the sky, strafed the runways and caught the few P-40 Warhawks that managed to get airborne, shooting them down before they could climb to combat altitude. Meanwhile, the torpedo bombers were making their second and third runs on the battleships that were still afloat. The Maryland, protected by the capsized Oklahoma, took 2 bomb hits but remained operational. The Tennessee, shielded by the burning West Virginia, was hit twice and damaged but not sunk. The Nevada, now underway and attempting to escape the harbor, drew the attention of every dive bomber in the second wave. Planes swarmed her like angry hornets, and the order was given: sink her in the channel. If the Nevada blocked the entrance to Pearl Harbor, the entire American fleet would be trapped and useless for months. The pilots concentrated their attacks, bomb after bomb smashing into the old battleship's deck until she was a floating inferno. But the Nevada's crew, with desperate skill, managed to beach her on Hospital Point, preventing her from blocking the channel. It was one of the few American victories of the morning, though it felt like nothing of the sort to the men who had just watched their fleet burn. By 8:30, the first wave was beginning to withdraw, their bomb bays empty and their fuel running low. Fuchida circled the harbor one last time, assessing the damage. The scene below was a nightmare of smoke, flame, and oil-covered water. He counted 4 battleships sunk or sinking, 4 more heavily damaged, and dozens of smaller ships burning at their moorings. The airfields were shattered. The anti-aircraft fire, which had been almost non-existent in the first minutes, was now growing heavier, black puffs of flak dotting the sky as American gunners overcame their shock and began to fight back. Fuchida radioed his assessment back to the Akagi. The attack had been devastating, but the job was not finished. The second wave was already approaching from the north. 171 aircraft under the command of Lieutenant Commander Shigekazu Shimazaki. They had taken off an hour after the first wave and were now closing on Oahu at 15,000 feet. Their targets were the ships that had survived the initial assault, the repair facilities, and the oil tank farms that surrounded the harbor. The pilots of the second wave were younger, many of them having never seen combat before, and they were flying into a sky that was now filled with smoke, flak, and a handful of American fighters that had managed to get airborne from the less damaged auxiliary fields. The resistance was stiffer than the first wave had encountered. The element of surprise was gone. American anti-aircraft gunners, now bloodied and furious, were putting up a curtain of lead, and the attacking planes had to fly through it to reach their targets. Shimazaki's dive bombers went for the cruisers and destroyers that were still afloat, damaging the Honolulu, the Raleigh, and the Shaw. A bomb hit the Shaw's forward magazine, causing an explosion so spectacular that it was photographed from the Japanese planes and became one of the iconic images of the attack. The high-level bombers dropped their payloads on the dry docks and repair shops, cratering the runways and destroying machine tools that would take years to replace. But the oil tanks, 45 million gallons of fuel oil stored in enormous white cylinders that were visible from miles away, remained untouched. So did the submarine pens, the power station, and the Navy Yard's administrative buildings. The pilots of the second wave were focused on the ships, as they had been trained to be, and the strategic infrastructure that would have crippled the Pacific Fleet's ability to recover went largely ignored. This was not an oversight in the attack plan. The plan had always prioritized the destruction of the battleships, but in retrospect, it was a choice that would haunt the Japanese high command within weeks. Aboard the Akagi, Vice Admiral Chuichi Nagumo paced the bridge and listened to the reports streaming in. The strike force had achieved tactical surprise. The battleships were burning. The American air power on Oahu had been neutralized. But one critical report was still missing: the location of the American aircraft carriers. The Enterprise, the Lexington, and the Saratoga were nowhere to be found in the harbor. They were at sea, delivering aircraft to Wake and Midway, and their position was unknown. Nagumo's staff officers, including the aggressive and brilliant Minoru Genda, urged him to launch a third wave. They argued that the fuel tanks, the repair facilities, and the missing carriers were the real prize, and that without them, the American fleet could recover far more quickly than the plan intended. They pointed out that the strike force had surprise for at least another day, that the American carriers were somewhere to the north or west, and that a search and destroy mission could finish the job permanently. But Nagumo hesitated. He had never believed in this operation. He had spent the entire voyage across the Pacific expecting to be discovered and destroyed by American submarines or long-range bombers. Now that he had delivered his assigned strike, his instinct was to withdraw and preserve the precious carriers. He listened to the reports from the second wave, increasing anti-aircraft fire, American fighters finally engaging. The prospect of launching a third strike against an alerted enemy with the element of surprise gone. He weighed the risk of losing his flight decks to a counterattack from the American carriers. That might be lurking just over the horizon, and he made his decision. At approximately 9:30, he gave the order to recover the second wave and withdraw to the north. There would be no third strike. The aircraft carriers that were the true heart of American naval power would live to fight. Another day, the second wave returned to their carriers in scattered groups, many of the planes riddled with bullet holes. 29 aircraft had been lost along with 64 men. Some of the pilots, elated by their success, lobbied their squadron leaders to refuel and rearm for another strike. They could see the smoke over Pearl Harbor on the horizon and knew there was more work to be done, but the orders were clear. The carriers turned north, and the strike force began its long, quiet journey back to Japan, leaving behind a shattered American fleet and a nation that, in the space of 2 hours, had been transformed from isolationist reluctance to white-hot fury. On the flight back, Fuchida sat in his observer's seat, staring at the receding column of smoke that marked Pearl Harbor. He understood the tactical success of what they had just accomplished. 4 battleships sunk, 4 damaged, over 300 aircraft destroyed, thousands of American sailors killed. He had personally witnessed the destruction of the Arizona and the Oklahoma, and he had reported it with a sense of duty fulfilled. But something nagged at him. The carriers had not been there. The oil tanks were still standing. The repair yards were damaged but not destroyed. And in the back of his mind, a memory surfaced of something Admiral Yamamoto had said during one of the final planning sessions. "We can run wild for 6 months," the Admiral had warned. "But after that, I have no expectation of success." Fuchida looked at the smoke and wondered if the clock had just started ticking. That night, as the strike force steamed northwest under heavy cloud cover, the mood on the Japanese ships was one of exhausted euphoria. Pilots gathered in the ready rooms, trading stories of their attack runs, sketching diagrams of the ships they had hit, and laughing at the memory of American sailors running across the decks in their underwear. Sake was broken out, and toasts were made to the Emperor, to the Admiral, to the pilots who had not returned. The aircrew who had been shot down or forced to ditch in the sea were mourned, but the loss ratio, less than 15% of the attacking force, was considered miraculously low. On the bridge of the Akagi, however, the senior officers were less celebratory. Nagumo, having made his decision to withdraw, was now wrestling with the implications of what he had left undone. And elsewhere in the fleet, a few thoughtful officers were already beginning to wonder what kind of retaliation they had just invited. Because, while the Japanese pilots had been bombing Pearl Harbor, the Japanese embassy in Washington had failed to deliver the final ultimatum to Secretary of State Cordell Hull until after the attack had already begun. The timing was supposed to be a diplomatic formality, a notification that negotiations had broken down, delivered moments before the bombs fell. Instead, it became a diplomatic catastrophe, transforming the entire operation from a surprise military strike into what the Americans would forever call a sneak attack. While the two nations were still technically at peace, President Roosevelt, upon receiving the news, sat in his wheelchair in the Oval Office and dictated a short, devastating speech to Congress. The next day, December 8th, he would deliver it, and the isolationist movement in America would collapse overnight. The United States, which had spent 2 years resisting involvement in the global war, would now throw its entire industrial and military might into the Allied cause. Yamamoto received the news of the attack's success in his cabin aboard the battleship Nagato, anchored in Hiroshima Bay. He listened to the reports of the battleships sunk, the aircraft destroyed, the minimal Japanese losses, and he nodded quietly. But those who were present later reported that he did not smile. He turned to his staff and spoke a line that would become famous. "I fear all we have done is to awaken a sleeping giant and fill him with a terrible resolve." He understood, perhaps better than anyone, that the strategic objective of the Pearl Harbor attack had already failed. The attack was meant to shock the United States into seeking a negotiated peace. Instead, it had united the American people in a way that nothing else could have, and it had left the most dangerous component of the Pacific Fleet, its aircraft carriers, completely intact. But the consequences of that failure were still months away. For now, the Japanese Empire had achieved exactly what it had set out to achieve. Simultaneous with the Pearl Harbor attack, Japanese forces had struck at Hong Kong, Malaya, Singapore, the Philippines, and Wake Island. The Southern Operation, the real objective of the war, was unfolding exactly as planned. The oil fields of the Dutch East Indies were within reach. The American battleship force, which had been the primary threat to those plans, was now burning on the floor of Pearl Harbor. For the next 6 months, the Imperial Japanese Navy would sweep across the Pacific like an unstoppable tide, winning victory after victory, just as Yamamoto had predicted. But the clock was ticking, and in the wardroom of the carrier Akagi, as the pilots raised their cups and sang old Navy songs, a handful of men sensed the truth that no one dared speak aloud. The real war was not over. It had just begun, and the American carriers were still out there, somewhere in the vast darkness of the Pacific, carrying with them the seeds of an answer that would come roaring back at Midway at Guadalcanal, and finally at the home islands themselves. The pilots who had bombed Pearl Harbor had not ended a war. They had opened one, and the morning they would realize they could not win it was closer than any of them imagined. The morning they would realize they could not win it arrived not as a single, dramatic revelation, but as a slow, creeping dread that seeped through the Japanese high command over the next 18 months, like seawater through a cracked hull. At first, however, there was only triumph. The strike force returned to Japan on December 23, 1941, sailing into the inland sea to a hero's welcome. The docks were lined with cheering crowds. The emperor himself issued a rescript commending the fleet. The newspapers were filled with photographs of burning American battleships, and the phrase "Victory on the Sea" was printed in bold, celebratory characters. In the wardrooms, the sake flowed freely. The pilots who had bombed Battleship Row were national icons overnight. Mitsuo Fuchida, the man who had shouted "Tora, Tora, Tora, Tora," was promoted and decorated, his name known in every household across the empire. And why should they not celebrate? In a single morning, they had neutralized the United States Pacific Fleet. With that threat removed, the Southern operation unfolded at breathtaking speed. Hong Kong fell on Christmas Day. Malaya and Singapore collapsed by mid-February, the supposedly impregnable fortress surrendering to a Japanese army that had outflanked it through the jungle. The Philippines, the Dutch East Indies, Burma, one by one, the resource-rich territories fell under Japanese control. Exactly as the planners had envisioned, the oil was flowing, the rubber trees were being harvested. The Greater East Asia Co-Prosperity Sphere was no longer a slogan, it was a map. But here is where the first hairline crack appeared, and it was in the very corridors of power that had authorized the attack. Admiral Yamamoto, the architect of the Pearl Harbor operation, did not celebrate. In the weeks following the attack, he withdrew into an increasingly bleak demeanor. In private conversations with his staff, he reiterated his pre-war assessment: "We have awoken a giant." He knew that the strike had failed to destroy the American carriers. He knew that the oil tanks and repair facilities at Pearl Harbor were still intact, allowing the Americans to salvage and rebuild their battleships far faster than the Japanese had anticipated. And he had read the intelligence reports about what was happening inside the United States. Instead of a horrified public demanding peace, the attack had produced exactly the opposite effect. The slogan, "Remember Pearl Harbor," was on every American lip. Recruitment offices were overwhelmed. Factory floors that had been building automobiles were being rapidly retooled for bombers and tanks. The American industrial machine, which Yamamoto had seen with his own eyes in Detroit and Pittsburgh, was beginning to stir. And in the shipyards of Norfolk and Mare Island, the keels of new warships were already being laid. The first counterpunch came sooner than anyone in Tokyo thought possible. On April 18, 1942, just over 4 months after Pearl Harbor, the Japanese home islands were struck by an enemy air raid. 16 American B-25 Mitchell medium bombers, led by Lieutenant Colonel James Doolittle, took off from the aircraft carrier USS Hornet and flew low across the Honshu coast, bombing targets in Tokyo, Yokohama, Nagoya, and Kobe. The damage was militarily insignificant. A few factories hit, a few dozen civilians killed, but the psychological impact was devastating. The sacred homeland, which had been untouched by foreign attack for centuries, had been violated. The emperor's safety was, for the first time, openly questioned, and the Japanese high command had no idea where the bombers had come from. The Americans had launched twin-engine bombers from a carrier. That was something no one had considered possible. The Doolittle raid shattered the illusion of invincibility. Worse, it humiliated the Army and Navy leadership, who had promised the nation that no enemy bomb would ever fall on Japanese soil. In the aftermath, a furious Yamamoto ordered the capture of Midway Atoll, a tiny speck of sand, 1,000 miles northwest of Hawaii, as a forward base to prevent future attacks. He also knew that if he could lure the American carriers into a decisive battle near Midway, he might still finish the job that Pearl Harbor had left undone. That battle came in early June of 1942, and it was a catastrophe that made Pearl Harbor look like a minor skirmish in the reverse direction. The Americans, having broken the Japanese naval code JN-25, Kane knew exactly where and when the attack would come. They positioned their 3 carriers, Enterprise, Hornet, and Yorktown, to ambush the Japanese strike force. On the morning of June 4th, Nagumo, once again in command of the carrier fleet, launched a strike on Midway Island itself. But reconnaissance reports were slow, confused, and contradictory. A Japanese scout plane spotted the American carriers too late, as Nagumo's crews were frantically rearming their planes from land attack weapons to anti-ship torpedoes. American dive bombers found them in a span of just 5 minutes, the infamous fatal 5 minutes. 3 Japanese fleet carriers, the Akagi, Kaga, and Soryu, were hit and turned into blazing hulks. The Hiryu, still operational, launched a counterstrike that crippled the Yorktown, but by late afternoon, she too was located and sunk. All 4 carriers, the very same decks that had launched the attack on Pearl Harbor, were now resting on the Pacific floor. Over 3,000 Japanese sailors and pilots were dead, including many of the elite aircrews who had trained for years and could never be replaced. That night, Yamamoto paced the bridge of the super battleship Yamato, still hoping to engage the Americans in a night surface action with his superior battleships. But the American fleet, under the command of Admiral Raymond Spruance, wisely withdrew east, denying him the fight. By dawn, Yamamoto had no choice but to order a general retreat. The defeat was so complete that the Japanese Navy immediately imposed a total news blackout. The wounded survivors, when they returned to Japan, were quarantined in isolated hospitals. Families were not told their sons were dead. The emperor was informed of the loss, but the public was fed stories of another glorious victory. Inside the naval staff, however, the truth was clear. The Pacific War had turned. The 6-month window that Yamamoto had predicted they could run wild had just slammed shut. The pilots who had survived Midway were among the first to truly understand the gravity of what had happened. Lieutenant Commander Tomonaga Joichi, the strike leader of the Hiryu's air group, had flown the morning attack on Midway in a plane with a punctured fuel tank, knowing he would not return. He did not survive the day. His sacrifice, and the sacrifice of hundreds like him, had bought nothing. The carriers were gone. The veterans of Pearl Harbor, the men who had dropped the torpedoes and the bombs on Battleship Row, were now dead or swimming in the oily waters of the Central Pacific. Fuchida, sidelined from Midway due to an emergency appendicitis and a broken ankle, watched from the hospital as the reports came in. He would later write that June 4th, 1942, was the day the Japanese Navy was suddenly forced to abandon forever its strategy of offensive warfare and to adopt a position of passive defense. The hunter had become the hunted, but the wait, it gets worse, moment was still unfolding, layer by layer, over the months that followed. Midway was a disaster, but it was a disaster the Japanese could still, in some deluded corner of the high command, rationalize. The battleship fleet was intact. The land-based air forces were strong. The southern resource area was secure. Perhaps the war could still be salvaged through a war of attrition. There was just one problem with that logic. The United States Navy was about to unleash a construction program so massive that it made every shipyard in Japan look like a backyard boat repair shop. In 1943 and 1944, the Americans launched over a dozen new Essex-class fleet carriers, each one capable of carrying nearly 100 aircraft. They built escort carriers by the dozens, hundreds of destroyers, and thousands of aircraft. The numbers are staggering. By the end of the war, the United States had commissioned over 100 carriers of various classes, while Japan struggled to complete just a handful. More importantly, while the Japanese had a rigorous but desperately slow pilot training program that took over a year to produce a single qualified carrier pilot, the Americans had instituted a massive, accelerated training pipeline that could churn out thousands of competent aviators annually. By 1944, the average Japanese carrier pilot had just 3 months of training before being sent to the front. The average American pilot had over a year. The qualitative gap that had been Japan's great advantage at Pearl Harbor had not only been erased, it had been reversed. The grinding reality of this disparity played out across the Solomon Islands at Guadalcanal from August 1942 to February 1943. The battle for that malarial, jungle-choked island was not a single carrier clash, but a 6-month meat grinder of naval combat, air attacks, and infantry slogging that bled the Japanese Navy of its remaining experienced pilots. The Imperial Japanese Navy, time and again, sent its dwindling carrier air groups into the waters off Guadalcanal, fighting desperate actions to supply and reinforce the island. The Americans called the channel north of Guadalcanal Iron Bottom Sound after the number of ships sunk there. For the Japanese, it was the graveyard of their naval air superiority. In a series of carrier battles, Eastern Solomons, Santa Cruz, the Japanese managed to damage the American carriers, but at an unsustainable cost in aircraft and men. By the end of the campaign, Japan had lost another 93 aircraft and most of the pilots who had flown at Pearl Harbor. The replacement pilots rushed through abbreviated training, lacked the skill and experience to compete with the increasingly battle-hardened American flyers. The balance of power in the Pacific had shifted, and it was never going to shift back. But here is the detail that truly illuminates the Japanese perspective during this period of slow, grinding realization. They did not tell the truth, not to themselves and not to the nation. The Japanese military's culture of face-saving, combined with a tradition of exaggerating enemy losses while suppressing Japanese ones, created a house of mirrors where even senior leaders began to believe their own propaganda. After every battle, Japanese naval commanders would report that they had sunk multiple American carriers, despite overwhelming evidence to the contrary. At the Battle of Santa Cruz, for example, the Japanese claimed they had sunk 4 American carriers and a battleship. In reality, they sank only 1, the Hornet. But these inflated figures were passed up the chain of command and printed in the newspapers. The emperor was briefed on victories that never happened. On the rare occasions when Japanese losses were reported, they were minimized to the point of fantasy. When the carriers Akagi, Kaga, Soryu, and Hiryu were lost at Midway, the Navy covered it up entirely. Even within the military, only a handful of officers knew the full extent of the disaster. The pilots who survived were forbidden from talking about it. This institutionalized denial created a toxic feedback loop. If the Navy believed it was winning, why change strategy? If the Americans were supposedly crippled, why sue for peace? The result was that the Japanese kept fighting long past the point where any rational assessment would have demanded surrender, and the gap between the perceived reality and the actual reality grew so vast that when it finally collapsed, it collapsed with catastrophic force. One of the few men who might have been able to shatter the illusion was Admiral Yamamoto himself. But in April of 1943, American intelligence intercepted and decrypted a message detailing his travel plans. On April 18th, exactly 1 year after the Doolittle raid, a squadron of American P-38 Lightnings intercepted Yamamoto's transport bomber over Bougainville and shot it down. He was killed instantly. The man who had planned Pearl Harbor and who had foreseen the disastrous long war was dead. His death was a devastating blow to Japanese morale, but it also removed the one voice in the high command who might have been able to force a realistic reckoning. From that point forward, there was no one with the combination of prestige and clear-sightedness to challenge the escalating madness. The series of defeats that followed reads like a slow-motion execution. In June of 1944, the Japanese carrier forces attempted one final, desperate offensive in the Philippine Sea. The result was a lopsided slaughter that the Americans called the Great Marianas Turkey Shoot. Over 200 Japanese aircraft were shot down in a single day, against minimal American losses. The carriers Shokaku and Taiho, the latter of which was the flagship and Japan's newest fleet carrier, were sunk by American submarines. The Taiho's loss was especially cruel. She sank after a single torpedo hit because of poor damage control and fuel system vulnerabilities that were never corrected. More than 1,600 men went down with her. The Third Fleet's air commander, Admiral Mitscher, had famously hung a banner from the bridge, "An enemy of ours is at sea, an enemy who will be fun to beat." And the Americans had fun indeed. After the Philippine Sea, Japanese carrier air power no longer existed as an effective fighting force. The carriers still floated, but they had no aircraft and no pilots to fly them. They were empty decks. In October of 1944, in a last, suicidal effort to defend the Philippines, the Japanese Navy enacted the Shogo Plan, a complex operation involving virtually every remaining surface ship in the fleet. The plan called for a northern decoy force, the surviving carriers, now empty, to lure away the American carrier fleet, while the battleships and cruisers of the southern force attacked the American landing ships in Leyte Gulf. It was an operation born not of confidence but of honor-bound desperation. The northern force, under Vice Admiral Jisaburo Ozawa, consisted of the Zuikaku, the last survivor of the Pearl Harbor attack carriers, and 3 other smaller carriers. They carried between them just 116 aircraft, many of which were piloted by men who had never landed on a carrier before. The plan worked in the sense that the American fast carriers did indeed chase the decoys north, leaving the invasion beaches temporarily exposed. But when the southern Japanese battle force, including the super battleships Yamato and Musashi, emerged from the San Bernardino Strait, they failed to press their advantage. The American escort carriers and destroyers fought a gallant, sacrificial action at the Battle of Sama, and the Japanese Admiral Kurita lost his nerve and turned back. In the north, the Zuikaku and her consorts were located and sunk by American planes. The last of the carriers that had launched the Pearl Harbor attack went down with her, battle flag flying and her crew lined up on the flight deck, saluting the Emperor's portrait as the sea rose to claim them. This was the end of the Imperial Japanese Navy as an offensive force. What remained of the fleet after Leyte Gulf was a collection of crippled, fuel-starved ships trapped in port. The home islands were cut off from the oil supplies that had been the entire reason for the war. The tankers that brought fuel from the Dutch East Indies were being sunk so rapidly by American submarines that by late 1944, Japan was importing only a trickle of what it needed to sustain its war effort. Warships that had once roamed the Pacific with impunity were now tied up in Kure and Sasebo, their fuel tanks empty. The pilots who were still alive had no planes. The planes that were being built had no fuel to fly them. The grand strategy that had begun with the stunning strike on Pearl Harbor had, in 3 years, delivered Japan to the brink of total collapse. This is when the Japanese High Command made its most fateful and horrific turn. The institutionalization of the kamikaze, the organized suicide attack. At first, it began as a desperate improvisation by frontline commanders in the Philippines, men who saw no other way to damage the American carriers closing in on the home islands. Vice Admiral Takejiro Onishi, the very same man who had been Yamamoto's trusted aide and who had first passed the Pearl Harbor plan to Commander Genda, was now the commander of the First Air Fleet in the Philippines. On October 20th, 1944, he addressed the first group of pilots designated for special attack missions. "The fate of the Empire rests on this one battle," he told them. "Your gods have asked for your lives. Will you give them?" The pilots raised their hands, and so began a new phase of the war, one in which the Japanese leadership was now sending its remaining youth to die not in combat, but in deliberate, flaming collisions with American ships. It was a tactic that inflicted horrific casualties. Over 7,000 Allied sailors were killed or wounded in kamikaze attacks during the Okinawa campaign alone, but it could not change the outcome of the war. It could only delay it and multiply the suffering on both sides. During this period, the industrial bombing campaign against the home islands intensified. American B-29 superfortresses, flying from the captured Marianas, began to incinerate Japanese cities one by one. On the night of March 9th to 10th, 1945, a firebombing raid on Tokyo killed an estimated 100,000 people in a single night, more than the immediate deaths from either of the atomic bombs that would follow. The wooden houses of the Shitamachi district burned so completely that the canals boiled. For the Japanese people, the war had arrived in their kitchens and their children's bedrooms. The promise that the homeland would be inviolate, the promise that the Navy was winning, the promise of the Greater East Asia Co-Prosperity Sphere. It all turned to ash, literally, in the firestorms that swept the cities. And yet, even as American fighters strafed the rice paddies, even as the rail network was shattered and the ports were mined, the military regime in Tokyo refused to surrender. The Supreme War Council, the so-called Big Six, was deadlocked. The army faction, led by War Minister Korechika Anami, insisted that the nation must fight on to the bitter end, that the entire populace must be mobilized for a final, suicidal defense of the homeland, code-named Operation Ketsu Go. The civilians were issued bamboo spears. School children were trained to charge tanks with explosive backpacks. The propaganda declared that 100 million souls would die together as a shattered jewel. It is against this backdrop of apocalyptic determination that the final, unmistakable realization occurred. Not on the deck of a burning carrier, not in a briefing room filled with bad news, but in a profound, existential moment when the old Japanese officers of the Navy, men who had been part of the Pearl Harbor planning and fought through the entire war, looked at the results of the American bombing campaign and admitted to themselves and each other that the war was lost. Admiral Mitsumasa Yonai, who had been Prime Minister in 1940 and had warned against war, was serving now as Navy Minister. In the spring of 1945, he confided to a colleague, "I think the war is lost. The only question is whether we accept unconditional surrender, or whether we fight on and see the nation destroyed." That sentiment was privately shared by many senior naval officers, including Admiral Somu Toyota, the chief of the Naval General Staff, who later admitted, "I knew we could not win the war from the very beginning, but I was bound by my duty to serve the Emperor and the nation." They had all known on some level, since the end of the Battle of Midway, maybe since the morning of Pearl Harbor when they saw the oil tanks still standing. But the culture of obedience, the weight of the sacrifices already made, and the fear of retribution had kept them silent. The realization was there, but the courage to act on it was not. The atomic bombs on Hiroshima and Nagasaki in August of 1945, and the Soviet invasion of Manchuria, were the external shocks that finally broke the deadlock. But even then, even after the complete annihilation of two cities in an instant, the Supreme War Council could not agree. It took the personal intervention of Emperor Hirohito, speaking in a recorded address broadcast to the nation on August 15th, to end the war. For the Japanese people, Hearing the Emperor's high, thin voice for the first time was a mystical and shattering experience. He told them they must endure the unendurable and suffer what is insufferable. For many, the implication was clear. The attack on Pearl Harbor, the great gamble that was supposed to deliver victory in a matter of months, had led them to this unimaginable ruin. A few weeks later, on September 2nd, 1945, the official surrender was signed on the deck of the USS Missouri in Tokyo Bay. The document was signed by Foreign Minister Mamoru Shigemitsu and General Yoshijiro Umezu, representing the Army. Noticeably absent from the ceremony, by his own request, was Admiral Nagano, the cautious skeptic who had opposed the Pearl Harbor attack from the start and who had, inexplicably decided to sail his carrier force away from it when a third strike might have changed everything. He had been sidelined after Midway and lived quietly, his reputation tarnished. Commander Minoru Genda, the brilliant planner, survived the war and went on to serve in the post-war Japanese Air Self-Defense Force. And Mitsuo Fuchida, the man who had shouted "Tora, Tora, Tora, Tora" over the radio, was sent to Hiroshima to assess the damage after the bomb. He was one of the few survivors from his survey party. Many of the others died of radiation sickness, and the experience turned him into a devout Christian evangelist. He spent the rest of his life speaking about peace and reconciliation, eventually even meeting with some of the Doolittle raiders he had once tried to kill. It was a strange, redemptive arc for the man who led the attack that started the Pacific War, but his personal journey from zealous warrior to penitent peacemaker is a mirror of the broader Japanese reckoning that followed defeat. The morning they realized they could not win was not December 8th, 1941, when Yamamoto muttered his warning about the sleeping giant. It was not June 4th, 1942, when the carriers burned at Midway. It was not even the firebombing of Tokyo or the fall of Okinawa. It was a gradual, excruciating process of disillusionment that shattered the myths of invincibility and divine destiny, one defeat at a time, until the nation stood in the ashes of its old beliefs and had to build something entirely new. And it all began with the decision to launch that first, fateful wave from the rolling deck of a carrier in the dark Pacific, heading for a Sunday morning harbor that would become a name synonymous with both audacious victory and catastrophic miscalculation. That morning, and everything that flowed from it, raises the final, unavoidable question: was it worth it? And for the men who flew the planes, the answer was far more complicated than any history book can convey. To find that answer, we have to follow them home. Not the grand strategic answer that historians debate in archives and lecture halls, but the personal one. The answer that lived in the quiet rooms where the surviving pilots grew old, in the prison cells where some awaited judgment, and in the strange, unexpected paths that opened when the war was finally, mercifully over. The men who bombed Pearl Harbor did not simply vanish into the footnotes of history. They lived, they struggled, they remembered, and for many of them, the morning of December 7th, 1941, was not the end of the story, but the first line of a long, unfinished reckoning that would span the rest of their lives. Take Vice Admiral Chuichi Nagumo, the reluctant commander who had paced the bridge of the Akagi and chosen to withdraw rather than launch the third wave. His life after Pearl Harbor was a slow descent into disgrace and despair. After the catastrophe at Midway, he was quietly removed from carrier command and sent to shore postings. He was damaged goods, a man whose name had become synonymous with caution and defeat in a navy that demanded boldness and victory. In the final year of the war, he was dispatched to command the Central Pacific Area Fleet based on Saipan, a crucial island that was about to be overrun by the American amphibious machine. On July 6, 1944, with American forces closing in on his command post, Nagumo retreated into a cave near the beach. He was 60 years old, a career sailor who had seen his beloved fleet annihilated. He sat down, pulled his service pistol from its holster, and shot himself in the head. The bullet did not kill him instantly. His staff officers found him groaning, and one of them, at his own request, finished the job with a single, merciful shot. Before his death, he had written a final letter to the emperor, apologizing for his failures. Nagumo's war ended in a dark hole on a remote island, a world away from the blazing oil fires of Pearl Harbor. He died knowing that the attack he had so doubted had led to the complete destruction of everything he had served. Commander Minoru Genda, the brilliant planner who had told Onishi that the attack was difficult, but not impossible, survived the war entirely intact. He was young, charismatic, and thoroughly a man of the new post-war order. After Japan's surrender, Genda joined the fledgling Japan Air Self-Defense Force, rising to the rank of lieutenant general and eventually serving as its chief of staff. He became one of the most influential figures in rebuilding Japan's air power, a symbol of continuity between the Imperial Navy's elite aviators and the modern, American Allied Japanese military. But Genda never fully recanted his hawkish views. In later life, he openly argued in favor of remilitarization and even visited India to advocate for a stronger Japanese military posture. He remained an unapologetic, somewhat controversial figure, the type of man who could plan a strike like Pearl Harbor and still believe, decades later, that the war had been a just cause ruined by poor execution. His personal reckoning was not one of guilt but of thwarted ambition. He would tell interviewers that the problem was not the attack but the lack of follow-through, the failure to finish off the American carriers and the fuel tanks. The loss of the war, in his view, was not a moral defeat but a logistical one. And then there is Mitsuo Fuchida, the strike leader, the voice of Tora, Tora, Tora. His path was the most dramatic and, in many ways, the most redemptive. After the war, Fuchida returned to a defeated Japan with no navy, no aircraft, and no purpose. He became a small-time farmer, scratching out a living in the scarred countryside. He was bitter and angry, convinced that the Americans had committed atrocities equal to anything the Japanese had done. And he testified at the Tokyo War Crimes trials with a defiant spirit. But his life took a sudden, tectonic turn in 1948. While passing through a railway station in Tokyo, he was handed a pamphlet by an American missionary. The pamphlet told the story of Jacob DeShazer, a former United States airman who had been one of the Doolittle raiders captured by the Japanese. DeShazer had been tortured, starved, and held in a prison camp for 40 months. He had watched his crewmates executed. But in that darkness, he had found a Bible, and he had become a devout Christian. Instead of returning to America consumed with hatred, he came back to Japan as a missionary, carrying a message of forgiveness. Fuchida read that story, and something in him cracked open. He bought a Bible. He read the story of Jesus forgiving his executioners, and he later said that in that moment he understood, for the first time, that the cycle of vengeance could be broken. By 1950, Fuchida had publicly converted to Christianity, a decision that shocked his former comrades and bewildered many Japanese who saw him as a national hero. He was baptized. He took his new faith and transformed it into a mission. He began traveling around the world, including to the United States, where he spoke in churches, at universities, and even to groups of veterans. He told his story of the Pearl Harbor attack, but he framed it now not as a tale of military glory, but as a cautionary lesson about the cost of hatred and the necessity of peace. The critical moment in Fuchida's post-war journey came in 1966, when he sat down with Flight Lieutenant William F. Hay, a survivor of the USS Arizona. Hay had been on the battleship that morning, and he had watched his friends burn. For years, he had carried a simmering resentment toward the Japanese pilots, who had killed them. When he learned that Fuchida was in town, he reluctantly agreed to meet. The two men talked for hours. They swapped their memories of December 7th, the same explosions, the same columns of smoke, but seen from opposite sides. By the end of that meeting, Hai said he felt the burden of his hatred lift. He forgave Fuchida, and Fuchida, in turn, asked for forgiveness. It was a small, quiet act of reconciliation between two old men, but it was a mirror of the larger, more improbable reconciliation that had already occurred between their two nations. Japan and the United States, once locked in a war of annihilation, had become the closest of allies. Trade flowed between them. American soldiers were stationed on Japanese soil. The battleships that had been sunk at Pearl Harbor were replaced by aircraft carriers that patrolled together in exercises, and the pilot who had led the attack was now a Christian evangelist touring American churches, shaking hands with the very men he had tried to kill. So, was it worth it for Fuchida? The answer was a profound no. He wrote in his memoirs that Pearl Harbor had been a strategic, moral, and spiritual catastrophe. He came to believe that the entire war had been a satanic delusion visited upon the Japanese people by their own militarist leaders. He dedicated his final years to building memorials of reconciliation, including a large cross-shaped monument near Pearl Harbor that he helped fund. He returned to Hawaii several times, each time weeping as he looked down on the harbor where he had once counted burning battleships with professional satisfaction. He died in 1976, at the age of 73, leaving behind a complicated legacy, the man who had launched the attack and the man who had spent the rest of his life trying to undo its spiritual damage. For Genda, the answer was more ambiguous. He never publicly expressed guilt for Pearl Harbor, and he remained a figure of nationalist pride. But his work in the self-defense force was undeniably constructive. He helped build a Japanese military that was defensive, constitutionally constrained, and deeply integrated into the American alliance, a military that would never again strike a first blow. The paradox of Genda is that the same strategic genius that conceived the carrier strike was later channeled into ensuring that Japan would never again attempt such a thing. The lesson he took from the war was not that aggression was wrong, but that picking a fight with a vastly superior industrial power was suicidal. That cold, pragmatic realism, in its own way, helped keep the peace. And for Nagumo, there was no answer at all. He took his own life before he could give one. But his caution, the very trait that Genda and others had cursed as cowardice, might be the thing that saved thousands of American lives. Had Nagumo been more aggressive and sent a third wave, he might have destroyed the fuel tank farms at Pearl Harbor, which held 4.5 million barrels of oil. That oil was the lifeblood of the Pacific Fleet submarines and carriers. Without it, the American counteroffensive would have been set back by at least 6 months, possibly a year. The island-hopping campaign might have stalled. The atomic bombs might not have been ready in time. The war might have dragged on with even higher casualties. But Nagumo chose to withdraw, and that choice, born of timidity and lack of faith in the plan, inadvertently spared the fuel that would power the American fleet all the way to Tokyo Bay. It is one of the great, tragic ironies of the story. The admiral who died in disgrace may have made the decision that ultimately enabled the American victory and, in a roundabout way, the relatively quick end to the war. Beyond the individual men, there is the broader question of whether the attack achieved anything of value for Japan. The answer is unequivocal. The Pearl Harbor strike sank 4 American battleships, but all but 2, the Arizona and the Oklahoma, were raised, repaired, and returned to service. The Oklahoma was pulled from the mud and partially restored, but it sank again while being towed to the mainland and was scrapped. The Arizona remains at the bottom of the harbor to this day, a rusting tomb for over 900 sailors whose remains were never recovered. The other battleships, the California, the West Virginia, the Tennessee, the Maryland, the Nevada, all were back in action by 1944, their guns bombarding Japanese positions on Saipan, Iwo Jima, and Okinawa. The attack that was supposed to put them out of the war for good only delayed them. And the carriers, the real strategic target, were never touched. The Enterprise, the Hornet, the Lexington, the Yorktown. These ships and their air groups would become the instruments of revenge, hunting and destroying the Japanese carrier fleet battle by battle. The Pearl Harbor attack was a tactical masterstroke that achieved exactly the wrong strategic outcome. It united the American people, failed to destroy the carriers, preserved the oil infrastructure, and set in motion a war of industrial attrition that Japan could not possibly win. The human cost of the attack, when seen from the Japanese perspective, was not just the 64 servicemen lost that morning. That was the initial, shocking success, only 29 planes downed, so few casualties that it seemed like divine protection. But the subsequent price was staggering. Over the course of the war, the Imperial Japanese Navy lost over 300,000 men. The elite carrier air groups that had been the envy of the world were ground into dust. The pilots trained with years of rigorous schooling were dead by mid-1943. Their replacements, young men with minimal training, were slaughtered in droves. At the Philippine Sea, American pilots reported that shooting down Japanese planes was like hunting turkeys. At Leyte Gulf, the carriers themselves, the pride of the combined fleet, were sunk, many of them empty of aircraft and used as decoys. By the end, the Japanese Navy had ceased to exist. The oil that had been the entire reason for the war was never securely delivered to the home islands. The American submarine blockade sank so many tankers that the fleet and the aircraft were starved of fuel. The Yamato, the largest battleship ever built, was dispatched on a one-way suicide mission to Okinawa with barely enough fuel to reach the island, and it was sunk before it got there. The grand strategy that began with the stunning, audacious raid on Pearl Harbor ended with the home islands isolated, starving, and being systematically burned to the ground. And then came the final, terrible punctuation: the atomic bombs on Hiroshima and Nagasaki, and the Soviet declaration of war. On August 6, 1945, an entirely new and horrible category of weapon was detonated over Hiroshima. One of the B-29 observers, Captain Robert Lewis, wrote in his logbook, "My God, what have we done?" 3 days later, Nagasaki. On August 15th, the Emperor spoke. The bombs shattered the last remnants of the military's will to resist. They also, paradoxically, provided a kind of exit strategy for the Japanese leadership, allowing them to surrender while saving face by pointing to an overwhelming, almost supernatural force rather than admitting defeat by conventional arms. The Emperor's recorded message was broadcast over crackling radio waves, and across the ruined cities and the smoldering naval bases, the Japanese people heard his voice for the first time. Many wept, some committed suicide, most simply stared at the radio in silence, trying to process the end of the world they had known. The occupation that followed was, by the standards of such things, astonishingly constructive. General Douglas MacArthur, the supreme commander for the Allied powers, oversaw the demilitarization and democratization of Japan with a surprisingly light hand. Given the ferocity of the war, the Emperor was retained as a ceremonial figurehead, a decision that prevented massive civil unrest. The new constitution, drafted in a week-long burst by young American legal officers and then revised by the Japanese government, contained the famous Article 9, which forever renounced war as a sovereign right of the nation. Japan's military, such as it would be, was limited to self-defense. The old Imperial Navy was dissolved. The surviving warships were scrapped or used as targets. The aircraft carriers that had survived the war were dismantled. Only a handful of support vessels and minesweepers remained for the new Maritime Self-Defense Force, which was not legally permitted to operate aircraft carriers at all. And yet, out of this total defeat, something unexpected and extraordinary occurred. The Japanese economy, reconstructed with American aid and fueled by the demands of the Korean War, grew at a rate that astonished the world. The manufacturers who had once built Zero fighters and torpedoes turned their factories to producing Toyota cars and Sony radios. The engineers who had designed the super battleship Yamato turned their skills to building the bullet trains and the super tankers that carried Middle Eastern oil across the globe. Japan, which had gone to war in 1941 to secure resources it lacked, now found itself by the 1970s as the second largest economy in the free world, peacefully trading with exactly the same nations it had once invaded. The co-prosperity sphere was a blood-soaked fantasy, but the actual prosperity that Japan achieved in the post-war era was entirely real, and it was built on a foundation of demilitarization and free trade. This is the ultimate irony of the Pearl Harbor story. The attack was meant to break American power in the Pacific and force a negotiation that would leave Japan dominant. Instead, it broke Japanese militarism and forced a transformation that left Japan more prosperous and more secure than it had ever been under the old regime. The men who flew the planes had been told they were fighting for the survival of their nation. In a strange and circuitous way, their fight did lead to that survival, but only because it failed so completely. The Japan that emerged from the ashes was not the Japan they thought they were defending. It was something better. There is one more detail, one final surprising thread that ties the whole narrative together and gives it a human shape. In 1991, on the 50th anniversary of the attack, a group of Japanese veterans of the Pearl Harbor attack traveled to Hawaii for a memorial service. They were old men by then, retired salarymen and grandfathers, carrying the same memories they had tried to bury for half a century. They stood on the memorial platform above the sunken Arizona, gazing down at the oil that still seeps slowly from the wreck, a tiny rainbow slick on the water that the sailors call the tears of the Arizona. Beside them stood American veterans, men who had been on those battleships, men who had been shot at and burned and dragged out of the harbor. The two groups looked at each other. Some shook hands. Some wept. A few embraced. There was no single moment of official forgiveness, no treaty signed between veterans. But in that small gathering under the Hawaiian sun, something was laid to rest that had nothing to do with politics and everything to do with ordinary men reconciling themselves to the extraordinary violence they had been part of. One of the Japanese veterans in attendance was Zenji Abe, a former dive bomber pilot from the carrier Akagi. Abe had dropped a bomb on the American ships that morning. He later said that for 50 years he had carried the image of the exploding harbor in his mind. But after standing on the memorial and shaking hands with an American who had been there, he finally felt like he could sleep. Another was Takeshi Maeda, a torpedo bomber crewman who had been shot down during the attack and was rescued by a Japanese midget submarine. He had survived the war, but his pilot had died. Maeda brought with him a small jar of sake and poured it into the water over the Arizona, a traditional offering to the spirits of the dead. The American veterans accepted the gesture with silent nods. In that quiet ritual, the war really ended for those men. And that, in the end, is the answer to the question that opened this long, winding story. Was it worth it? Number, by every conceivable measure, strategic, moral, human, the Pearl Harbor attack was a catastrophe for Japan. It killed tens of thousands of Japanese servicemen indirectly, led to the complete destruction of the Imperial Navy, and resulted in the firebombing and atomic bombing of the home islands. The morning they realized they could not win came slowly, but it came with a certainty that crushed the arrogant assumptions of the early victories. But out of that catastrophe came a different kind of Japan, a Japan that had learned at terrible cost the limits of military power, a Japan that turned its productive genius to peaceful ends, and a Japan that, through the unlikely journeys of men like Mitsuo Fuchida and Zenji Abe, found a way to reconcile with its former enemies. The attack on Pearl Harbor remains one of the most studied military operations in history. Its tactics are still taught in war colleges. Its strategic failures are analyzed as case studies in the dangers of wishful thinking and ideological blindness. And yet, the story is not just a military lesson. It is a human one. It is a reminder that the men who push the buttons and pull the triggers are not faceless automatons. They are human beings with families, with doubts, with the capacity for both terrible violence and profound change. The pilot who said, "Tora, Tora, Tora," ended his life as a man of peace. The admiral who ordered the withdrawal died in a cave. The planner who thought the attack was difficult, but possible, lived to build a new Japanese Air Force that would never again strike first. All of them, in their own ways, were shaped by that single morning in December, and their lives after it are a testament to the strangeness of history. The attack did not bring victory. It brought loss, devastation, and eventually, a peace that was harder and more valuable than any of them could have imagined when they climbed into their cockpits in the dark. The attack did not bring victory. It brought loss, devastation, and eventually, a peace that was harder and more valuable than any of them could have imagined when they climbed into their cockpits in the dark. And yet, if you walk through the memorials that now dot Hawaii and Japan, you will find no shortage of people who insist that the story of Pearl Harbor is simply one of villains and victims. But the deeper you dig, the more that simplicity crumbles. History is not a morality play. It is a labyrinth of human beings making calculations with imperfect information, driven by fear, pride, desperation, and occasionally something closer to hope. The Japanese pilots who flew that morning were not cackling demons. They were young men, many of them barely 20, who had been raised in a militarized society that taught them their destiny was to lead Asia out of Western colonialism, by force if necessary. They had been told that the United States was strangling their homeland, that oil was life, and that the emperor was divine. They did what they had been trained to do, with extraordinary skill, and they believed, in the moment, that they were saving their nation. It was only later, in the hospital wards, in the prison camps, in the quiet farms of the post-war countryside, that the full moral weight of those bombs began to settle on their shoulders. And what of the Americans? The men on those battleships were also young, also far from home, also doing what their nation had asked of them. They had no warning. They died in their bunks, in the water, in the flaming oil. The survivors carried the trauma for the rest of their lives, but they also carried a righteous fury that powered the greatest military-industrial effort the world has ever seen. That fury was not always pretty. It led to the internment of Japanese American citizens, to the firebombing of civilian neighborhoods, to the atomic incinerations. The war stripped away innocence on both sides, and it left a scar that took decades to heal. The fact that the healing happened at all is nearly as remarkable as the attack itself. When you step back and look at the entire arc, from the secret planning sessions in Tokyo, through the screaming dive bombers, through the burning carriers at Midway, through the desperate kamikaze dives, all the way to the quiet handshakes on the memorial above the Arizona, you are left with a single, unavoidable question that no history book can fully answer. What does it take for a nation or a person to truly learn the lesson? Japan, in 1941, had all the evidence it needed. that starting a war with the United States was a losing gambit. Yamamoto told them. The economic data told them. The simple geography of the Pacific told them. And yet, the machinery of militarism, the weight of institutional momentum, the fear of losing face, all conspired to push the fleet out of Hitokapu Bay and into the storm. The human capacity for self-deception, especially when amplified by collective nationalism, is almost unlimited. That is the cautionary heart of this entire story. It is not that the Japanese were uniquely foolish or uniquely evil. It is that any nation, when it feels backed into a corner, when its leaders believe they have no good options, can convince itself that a catastrophic gamble is the only path to survival, and it can do so with a sincerity that makes the subsequent disaster feel less like a crime and more like a tragedy. The lingering question, then, is not, was Pearl Harbor a success or a failure? The lingering question is, what would it take for us, today, to recognize our own self-deceptions before they launch us into our own catastrophic gambles? The sleeping giant that Yamamoto feared is not merely an industrial capacity. It is the human conscience, which can slumber through years of propaganda and nationalism, but which, once awakened, demands a terrible accounting. The Pacific War was that accounting. The peace that followed was the expensive gift purchased by all that suffering, and it is a gift that requires constant, deliberate maintenance. The alliance between Japan and the United States, which seems so natural now, was built over the graves of millions. It endures not because people forgot, but because they remembered and they chose, with great effort, to build something different. So, as you settle into your own quiet darkness, wherever you are in the world, consider what it must have felt like to be on the deck of the Akagi that morning, to feel the hum of the engines, to see the green flare arc into the sky, and to know that you were part of something that would change the planet forever. Consider what it must have felt like, 3 years later, to be a replacement pilot with 50 hours of flight training, staring at an American fleet that stretched to the horizon, knowing your nation was asking you to die. Consider what it must have felt like, 50 years later, to stand on a memorial platform in Hawaii, to look into the eyes of your former enemy, and to realize that the war was finally, truly over, not just on paper, but in your own heart. That is the weight of history. It is heavy, it is complicated, and it is, in its own strange way, hopeful. The same species that built the Zero fighter and the atomic bomb also built the reconciliation, memorials, the peace constitutions, and the friendships that now span the ocean that was once a battlefield. We end this long journey not with a neat moral, but with an invitation. The next time you read about a geopolitical crisis, the next time you hear leaders promising quick victories and easy solutions, remember Pearl Harbor. Remember that the men who start the shooting rarely see the end of it. Remember that the sleeping giant, whatever form it takes, always awakens. And remember that even after the worst is done, the human capacity to rebuild, to reconcile, and to create something better is never entirely extinguished. If you've drifted off somewhere along the way, you've done exactly what this channel is for. These stories are meant to carry you into sleep with real, complex history, not with fairy tales. But if you are still listening, still thinking about Fuchida's conversion, still picturing the oil seeping from the Arizona, then I have a small request. Before you close your eyes, take a second to like the video and subscribe, but only if you actually enjoy drifting off to deeply factual history. Drop a comment telling me where you are listening from and what time it is for you. I love reading those. It reminds me that we're all just people in different time zones, under the same stars, trying to understand the same complicated world. Now dim those lights, burrow into your blankets, and let the Pacific waves carry you the rest of the way. Sleep well. History will still be here when you wake.